right track here.
That's right. Have you talked to people at International Reading? You've talked to Leslie Morrow?
Yes,
or
we interviewed
so you
her
interviewed
on
her?
Monday.
Okay. Up at
Dr.
Rutgers,
Piazza?
or where did you?
No, at the IRA here.
At the headquarters here in Washington.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Leslie's a good person. I worked with her years ago. So, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Had a great interview with her. We interviewed the ambassador of Bangladesh.
Really?
Yeah, he had some interesting things to say.
Now, why? Was he involved in UNESCO stuff?
He was
or?
the one hosting the International
Oh,
Literacy Day at his
okay.
embassy.
Okay.
And so it actually, they said, well, would you like to interview him?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so
yeah,
we did.
yeah. Good.
And it was interesting.
Good.
Give a small, we talk ourselves, did a couple minute overview, what's going on.
Good.
Yeah, so it was overall. But we also did Don Nathanson, who you probably don't know, who is the kind of scientist of affects, how affects work,
Mm-hmm.
the relationship between affects and cognition.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, affects are the
Mm-hmm.
spotlight, it creates the focusing channel, the cognition's working inside of it.
Mhm,
Very intricate relationship
mhm,
between them. And of course,
Mhm.
as you would recall from our phone conversation, this is super critical because once shame begins to form and conscripts with decoding reflexes, it's become radical.
Did Reed speak to any of that? Did you
Yeah,
ask
he did.
him about
He certainly
that?
understood as we tracked through
Yeah,
the space. He
yeah.
had his own agenda about what to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's going to be something that your research scientists are going to be tracking on a lot more probably than I would be.
Right, but we want to make this, 8th graders enough to get it.
Good, good. I'll take the 8th grade slot.
Okay, well, one of the things that we're going to do, I think, frankly, that we ought to collaborate. We ought to find a group that can collaborate on this and do this part really well. But one of the things I'm really interested in doing, we've designed a set where we're going to be able to look at the text the child's reading, and then move to actually be able, almost kind of like a virtual tour. If you will.
Mm-hmm.
We can move from the text to the face,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we're going to mirror it out in such a way that we can see the face and the text together.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you can see what's going on in the face while they're trying to attempt to articulate, while they're looking at the code. And then we're going to spin around holding some of that
Yeah.
while we go, still keeping that visible, semi-opaque, transparent, drop into a multimedia animation that's happening in the brain.
fMRI, sort of where the brain is firing. And
Yes, at one point, that a simulation of that. Another time, a multimedia, more logical schematic in operation, showing the relationship between these various processes happening in real time, in relation to the code, in relation to the expressions of the face, the tone of voice, as we go in and out of decoding fluidly and automatically into stuttering up and into shame. So that we actually can see the correspondence between this code confusion, the stuttering of mind, the movement into shame, and the dark downward spiral into the collapse.
Yeah, the stuttering of mind. I haven't heard that one before. That's an interesting way to put it. But I think of it as, I've seen the fMRIs. It looks very much as if the brain of dyslexics is working overtime. I mean, so often, kids with learning disabilities are accused of being lazy. They're lazy. They can't do it. They're not trying hard enough. And when you look at the fMRIs, you see very clearly that that brain is trying to work very, very hard to make sense of what's in front of it, right? And it can't do it. It's firing away very inefficiently, ineffectively, and the code is not being broken if it's a decoding task, or the words are not being comprehended if it's a comprehension task. So it's absolutely fascinating.
They're not co-implicating. These various many-level processes which have to cooperate in such great synchronized aren't.
Well, and the point for kids with learning disabilities is that again, it demonstrates that this is not an issue of laziness. It's not an issue of not trying. Kids with learning disabilities try very, very hard. Yeah.
That's great. Well, let's get into our time here. First of all, I'd like to start by saying welcome and thank you. I really appreciate you making the time. You've been one of the who kind of made all this happen in a certain way in this trip.
Well, David, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So maybe just to give us some background reference, so you can spend a couple minutes and tell us about yourself, how you come to be here, and then from that, what is the National Center for Learning Disabilities? Why does it exist? What does it do?
Well, I'm here because my career the last 20-some years has been spent building literacy and learning programs for kids primarily. That's what I've spent my time doing, working with not-for-profit organizations, working closely, especially recently, with people in the research community as well as practitioners to bring those programs actually to the field, to get them to kids, to get them to teachers, so that they can start to make a difference. Prior to coming to the National Center for Learning Disabilities, I spent many years at Reading is Fundamental, and the goal there was to provide access to books for kids who generally did not have access. The challenge that I faced in coming to the National Center for Learning Disabilities was to address this access issue in a new way, to ensure that kids with learning disabilities had access not just to books and to learning materials, but had access to a curriculum, had access to teachers who were well trained, had access to the kind of evaluation procedures that would really test what they knew rather than what they didn't know or couldn't do. So that's what attracted me and why I came to the National Center about 4.5 years ago as executive director.
What personally hooks you about this work?
Well, I think all of us are challenged by the toughest cases. And when you look at the kinds of struggles that face children with learning disabilities, you quickly realize that these kids face a lot of obstacles. There are a lot of challenges. So I'm especially drawn, and the people that I work with in the research community, in the advocacy community, are very much attracted to this group of kids and adults to make life better, to give them opportunities that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Pause for a second. I want to check something.
Do you think maybe I can put that down there and I can take sips? The Coke, I think sounds good. Thanks a lot.
We are not picking up the hissing of the
I'm good.
Does that work?
About the downward angle of this that disturbed me initially, and I just wanted to double check that.
So my eyes are
Yeah,
in line and
looking. I meant to do that before I sat down.
Yeah.
And just to double check from my
okay.
perspective. I also want to hug the camera. So that
Okay.
Good. So thank you very much. We're back on track.
Okay.
National Center for Learning Disabilities. Implicitly, you must have some operational definition of learning itself.
I think when you talk to people in the field of learning disabilities and ask about learning, you quickly start zeroing in on processing. How does information processing impact learning? And as a very, very key component of the learning process. And for kids, for adults with learning disabilities, that's where the chief problem is. How the brain either does or does not process information. How the brain, sometimes very inefficiently, retrieves information, stores information, processes it, and expresses information. So any theory of learning for us is very practical. You know, how do people make sense, especially sense of language and of other kinds of information that their brain has to work with.
So rather than being subject specific or topical out at kind of the outer boundaries of extremes, you're more on the kind of core process of processing.
Well, the information processing really is an issue for learning disabilities that cuts across so many different disabilities. The term itself is an umbrella term and really encompasses a wide range of disorders and problems, the biggest one being dyslexia or reading disability. And even within reading disability, there could be problems with decoding. There could be problems with comprehension. Could be problems with expression, any number of things. So it's the processing of information that is really critical. We talk about content, certainly we talk about reading, we talk about, there's now a good deal of research that's being initiated in mathematics. That's all very important. At rock bottom, how does the brain either work or not work in dealing with that information?
An important distinction here is the difference between a biological insufficiency in this development of capability to process as distinct from a instructional or learning context inefficiency or deficiency that's led to a learned or acquired learning disability. How is those two related? How does that spectrum play out in your organization?
Well, I don't think we draw that kind of distinction. I think there's a difference between a student who is a quote-unquote instructional casualty. In other words, a student who has not flourished in the schools, who has not had access to the right kind of teaching. A student, whom the schools have failed in some way. There's a difference between that kind of student and a student with an underlying neurobiological learning disability. So a LD, learning disability, is not acquired. It's there. It's lifelong. It's real. And it can be expressed in any number of ways. Early on, it could appear later in a school career, even as late as high school or adulthood.
They come in at different developmental stages.
Different stages depending upon the kinds of learning tasks that a person might actually face. Yeah.
So you don't make a distinction between these across the spectrum as to what may be the cause of it.
Well, we'd love to know the cause. We'd love to know the cause.
I mean, the distinction between what's a neurobiological root and what's an instructional casualty.
Well, I think most people, and especially when you talk to teachers, the kinds of problems that they're trying to deal with, the weaknesses that they're trying to address in children, whether they have a neurobiological cause or whether the cause has been simply lack of access to a certain kind of instruction or teaching, sometimes that makes very little difference because an appropriate scientifically research-based intervention that's delivered in the right kind of way can address both of those problems. I mean, that is good news for teachers. It simplifies the task. It says that what works for kids with learning disabilities, reading disabilities, for example, also works for students who may have problems with reading because they didn't have access to books or spoken language as they were growing up, kids from poverty.
Right. And I totally understand and appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that with respect to what to do, how to be helpful to any particular individual child,
Mm-hmm.
what the causes is less important than meeting them on the edge of whatever they're showing and working
Mm-hmm.
with them at that level.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the kind of social education that we need to reduce the amount of instructional related casualties, the more that we understand. I mean, like, for example, in our conversations with Dr. Lyon, he suggested that 96%, in that kind of range, was instructional rather than neurobiological relative to reading.
Right. I think there's good research that points to the dramatic efficacy of good instruction. And it is true that not enough good instruction is getting to kids. Kids just don't have the benefit of it. Teachers need to be trained in order to carry out the kind of instruction that's effective. And there is good research to show that up to 95% or so of reading problems, reading difficulties, can be effectively addressed if that instruction is there, delivered in the right way. That still leaves about 4 to 6%, 5% of the student population that is not responding, that's still struggling, that needs some other kind of intervention, some other kind of instruction. And interestingly, the number of children, the percentage of children in the school-age population that have learning disabilities right now is about 5%. And they need even more intensive, individualized instruction in order to address their underlying problems. Not all the problems are going to be solved simply because we get classroom teachers up to a certain level.
For sure.
Yeah.
Where I look at this is, as Dr. Whitehurst said yesterday, we could take the basic and below reading or the proficient and below reading. If we aggregate the population, we're talking about most of our children are reading less than proficient.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Most of them.
Yes.
And we know that the consequences of reading not well is profound in shaping you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So to some degree, all of the children who are not learning to read well are developing some you could say some degree of disability to learn.
I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't go there. I think it's important to maintain some distinctions.
Sure.
There's a reading crisis in the United States. It's undeniable. 39%, almost 40% of fourth graders do not read even at the basic level. And as we know, a majority of students do not read at the proficient level. In inner cities, the percentages are much higher. So there's a profound reading crisis in the United States. Children with reading disabilities and other learning disabilities are part of that reading crisis. They're part of that group. And their problems need to be addressed as well. And we need to reach children, whether they have reading disabilities or whether they have reading difficulties, virtually in the same way, and reach them early on before they even get to kindergarten, and identify where they have strengths, where they have weaknesses, and then step in with appropriate kinds of instruction. By doing that, by reaching out to all those children, we can ensure that, one, the children with difficulties can actually be brought up to speed, can be brought up to grade level in reading. And they have a very good chance of having that happen. But we also ensure that children with reading disabilities and other learning disabilities are identified early on and have the chance to have the opportunity to get better instruction, individualized instruction, special education services early on rather than later in upper elementary school or middle school when it's very difficult and very inefficient to address their problems.
Good. Thank you. I appreciate and agree with the distinction in the focus. I'm just trying to stretch us out.
We're not going to go, as some will say, that 15 to 20% of the population has a reading disability. The data don't support that. They don't support that. About 5% of children in the schools have been identified with a learning disability. None of us is happy, is satisfied with the methods that are currently being used to identify children. However, there's pretty good history over 10, 20 years to suggest that we're in the right ballpark regarding the percentage of the population that might have a true disability.
Right, but let's suppose for just a moment, and I have other questions. Let's suppose just for a moment that your position wasn't the National Center for Learning Disabilities, but the National Center for Stewarding the Health of Learning.
Absolutely. And
You
what?
were the executive director of the National Center for Stewarding the Health of Learning of our children. From that vantage, we then take a look at reading and the consequences of reading, the consequences of not reading well early. I mean, there's the Matthew effect, what reading does for the mind in terms of developing self-reflexivity, in terms of developing core cognitive processing, intelligence, efficiency, abstraction. For example, Leslie Moreau said one day that reading is so predictive that some states, from literacy data, project how many prison cells to build. That some research is saying that how fast a child is coming up to speed in reading in the first grade predicts where they're at in the 12th grade. It's that solid correlation. So how children come into learning profoundly affects how healthily they learn in their life.
Reading is the gateway skill. It leads to all sorts of success, much success, both academically and in life. It's the skill that undergirds most of the curriculum. And if children aren't learning that skill by the end of third grade, they're in desperate trouble. For kids with learning disabilities, it's a double whammy. 70 to 80% of students with learning disabilities have their main problem in the area of reading, language-based learning disabilities. So for us in the learning disabilities world, we're very much concerned about literacy, about getting children up to speed in reading. And that usually means an early diagnosis and very intensive intervention, breaking skills down into individual steps so that students can actually learn step by step the decoding process, everything that goes into that, plus comprehension strategies. It's incredibly important. You said, do we, if I were looking out for all kids, well, in many ways we do. The learning disabilities field of the National Center for Learning Disabilities is very interested in the well-being of all kids. That's why we're calling for universal early literacy screening. Every 4-year-old should have the chance to have screening of his or her skill development in literacy before entering kindergarten. It should be universal, just as it is for vision and hearing. We should know where a child is in making progress or not making progress on the road to reading, because reading is so important. It is the gateway skill.
Excellent. I totally agree. I guess where I've been trying to go, and then, is that, again, most of our children aren't learning to read well. Most.
Mm-hmm.
And not learning to read well is learning capacity diminishing.
Mm-hmm.
So most of our children, in the process of their struggle to learn to read, are going through a process that's diminishing their ability to learn.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to me to be the nation's biggest learning disability.
Well, there is a reading crisis, and the reading crisis leads to an education crisis, and is certainly connected to an economic crisis as you look at job formation. And do we have the people coming through the school system who can really perform the job functions that American business has to have? The answer to that now is clearly no. The schools are not producing. And what we're really talking about is lost human potential. And it's tragic. It's tragic. Parents who have children with learning disabilities have lived this tragedy for many, many years. They know what it's like to see a child not able to fully embrace what a school has to offer. And they've seen schools that have failed in reaching the children, have failed in actually addressing the children's individual methods of learning and addressing their needs.
Yes. I just think that the parents of the 60% or 68% or whatever number you want to say that are below proficient don't grasp the significance of this in terms of how learning disabling, learning constraining the effect of this is, because it's accepted while it's kind of almost normal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's a gross miss of how significant this is to the developmental process.
Well, there's been some good news over the past 10, 15 years. Some good news is that I think there have been many campaigns with some success in focusing on children's books, reading to children, reading aloud to children, making sure that children have access to literacy opportunities. A lot of talk and a lot of campaigning about that, and it's done some good, and it's helpful. What we've seen less of is sort of the hard edge of literacy, the instruction. What kind of instruction, in what kind of setting, over what period of time is most effective in getting children up to speed in reading? Now, we have some reports, we have some good studies that have come out, and there have been efforts to get the word out, not only to parents and the public, but certainly to schools, the 15,000 school districts around the country who are making decisions every day about how to teach kids the skill of reading. And the real problem, the tragedy, is that even now, we see that school districts are not fully embracing the most effective methods of teaching reading to children. They are not doing it, and they need more help, they need more guidance in making better decisions about the instructional materials they use and also the kind of professional development that teachers need in order to be effective. Because teachers do want to be successful. They do want to help kids, but they're not being given the chance. We need to raise public awareness, and we need to change the way that decisions are made in schools. Parents can be a loud voice. They can be terrific advocates, not just for various kinds of activities in a school, but specifically advocates for curriculum reform to make sure that reading is being taught in the most effective way. That's what we want to hear. That's what we need to produce across the country.
And excellent, thank you. That was really good jewels. And as you said, we need a screening tool. You want to check where children are at when they're coming in.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we want to check their eyes and their ears. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, where are they at in the developmental spectrum? So we can meet them closer to where they actually are rather than overgeneralize.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have the means now to screen children for early literacy skill development. It's not invasive. It does not involve testing kids, but with 20 questions over a period of 12 minutes costing less than $2 per child, a teacher or a parent or a paraprofessional can be trained to actually screen a child and understand what it means. That kind of information is incredibly valuable to an early childhood educator, to a preschool teacher. At age 4, to understand how a child is making progress in areas such as knowledge of print, or written expression, or linguistic awareness, knowledge of how language works. There's much that can be learned, and once teachers and parents understand that, they can then become better teachers, whether it's in the home as a parent or whether it's in the preschool. And there is a revolution coming. It is happening. Instruction, curriculum, an emphasis on cognitive development, an emphasis on early literacy skill development. It is coming to preschool. It's there. And over the next 5 to 10 years, that's going to be a very important new frontier in the literacy movement.
And one more step on this front end.
Mm-hmm.
What we're saying is that how well children learn to read, I mean, it's all but fading to their academic, economic, psychological, intellectual, cognitive health.
Mm-hmm.
It's that pervasively powerful. And that a great deal of this depends on the soundness of the instructional process,
Mm-hmm.
the educational process, but also on the preparation of the child long before they get to school,
Mm-hmm.
how they're unfolding. That's in fact critical, how they come to school,
Mm-hmm.
how well that they've started to develop and exercise the kind of sound and letter distinctions and what
Mm-hmm.
have you, and familiarity with the correspondence between oral and written languages and so forth, which are the ideal ground to pick up from and move with in
Mm-hmm.
education. That solidly rests on the parents.
Well, all of us have a responsibility to kids, to our youngest kids. Certainly parents have that responsibility to help them develop the language skills, the literacy skills, so that they're ready to embrace school when the time comes. And it's true that children who come from backgrounds of poverty are at a tremendous disadvantage by the time they actually enter kindergarten. They're lagging in skill development. Their vocabularies are dwarfed by the vocabularies of children from middle class and upper middle class homes who've been surrounded by language in very different ways. And so they enter the schoolhouse door, they enter the classroom really lacking the equipment, lacking the context to even understand a lot of what the teacher might be saying. They don't know the names of things. It's not just that they don't know, in many cases, the letters of the alphabet. It's that they don't know the names of things. They lack language.
Insufficiently rich oral language development from which to move into.
Correct, correct. And as we talk about, the development of literacy skills, certainly we can't neglect vocabulary development, oral language experience. It's probably one of the most difficult areas to work in and it's the one subject to the least amount of control. Most of it is not in the classroom, it's out of the classroom, and it's oral, it's not written, very difficult to control.
So it seems so important for parents to, across the spectrum, socioeconomically,
Right. Well,
understand how significant this is.
Well, it's important. There are some things, there are some steps that parents and teachers can take to help improve comprehension and to build vocabulary development. One of the areas is actually in the sharing of children's books. One of the programs actually that Dr. Whitehurst has developed called Dialogic Reading addresses this very issue. We all say, those of us who've worked in the literacy world, we've all said, share a book. But we also know, those of us who have worked in this area, we know that many parents and some teachers simply do not know how to share a book effectively with a child. It may sound bizarre, but it's true. Videotape doesn't lie. When you're actually running demonstration programs and then studying what happens when a child, an adult, and a book share time together. The dialogic reading technique that Dr. Whitehurst has developed, and it's really the only research-based program of its kind, is really there to encourage a specific kind of interchange between a child and an adult with a text as the shared experience. So a child is actually drawn out to answer certain questions, to use language, to point, and in doing so, is led through a series of exercises that actually builds language skill and vocabulary development.
Focus their distinctions.
And to demonstrate that he or she knows what's being said and developed in a story, whether it has to do with colors, characters, words on the page, letters on the page, any of those things.
More metacognitive summaries, not just...
Right, an understanding of plot, an understanding of the beginning, the middle, the end, all those things. Are we heading in? Are we getting some stuff?
No, you're doing great. Fantastic. I really appreciate the precision, clarity, tone.
Okay, good.
Do you have any sense of what it costs us to teach our children to read?
You know, I saw that question. I don't have a number for you. I don't have a number.
Rough idea, percentage of...
No. I can tell you that for those children who need remediation, if children do not have reading fluency by the end of third grade, it's going to cost 7 to 8 times as much in time and in money to address their reading problems and get them up to grade level in reading.
But 7 or 8 times X, I don't know.
Right. In other words, yeah, I don't have that. Yeah. The deal is with, in terms of dollars, I mean, every school district spends a different amount, per child, and that's a statistic that is usually a very important one for school districts to trot out and either pride themselves on spending so little or pride themselves on spending so much, depending upon where you live and what the property tax is like. But I think it'd be very difficult to come up with something like that, for the country as a whole, just because there's so much diversity.
There's a lot of talk about the kind of aggregate expense of reading difficulties, from the $200 billion in lost income opportunities to the adults that can't read above a 5th grade level, to the cost that organizations are spending, literacy organizations, federal government, and so forth, to remediate reading and so forth. Do you have any number, any scope at all that you can put on that?
I don't have a dollar figure again. But
magnitude of order.
It's billions, billions lost. I think the main thing to emphasize for anyone who has worked with a child or with an adult who has a reading problem either is low literate or is just struggling with reading, is that it's very apparent that the lost human potential, the lost self-esteem, that's the most poignant. And in the end, it's the most significant, because the loss in self-esteem and is what leads to a whole host of social pathologies that are very difficult to look in the face. The crime problem and substance abuse, school dropout, any of those things, very difficult to face. And there is a line to be drawn between low literacy skills and those social pathologies.
You say as much about this as you care to.
Well, if we just look at the issue of dropout and look specifically at students with learning disabilities, there is a 27% dropout rate of students with learning disabilities. That is more than twice the rate of the general population. And these are kids, by definition, who have the same kind of intellectual equipment, the same kind of potential as all the other kids in the population, and yet they're dropping out at a rate twice as high. Lost human potential. And there are problems with abuse, substance abuse, problems, juvenile justice problems associated with it. Research is being done. There is in the field of learning disabilities, I can't point to anything that is absolutely conclusive, but there is a connection. And certainly in looking at the general population of students and dropout, low literacy, one can go to prisons, and it is very apparent that the majority of inmates lack reading skill.
As I said when we began our conversation, when we talked on the phone, you referred to this interview where somebody had asked you, I'm not going to repeat the question for it. What has the last decade, what have we learned?
Mm-hmm.
You think that, what have we learned about the center of this problem?
Mm-hmm. Well, over the past 10 years, we've learned that learning disabilities are real. For those who ever doubted, it's absolutely apparent now in the science that learning disabilities are real. The brain research and the fMRI research showing images of the brain at work reveal conclusively that dyslexia, reading disabilities, are real. We understand where in the brain the problem is and the functioning that is not happening in those who are experiencing that disorder. And it's also leading us toward instruction. It's leading us toward ways that we address the problem. And that really is the challenge for the next 10 years, to apply the basic science, the research that's taken us so far in understanding the root cause, the issues, the neurological basis, and moving toward practice. How do we train teachers so that they can carry out instruction in a way that effectively addresses the reading problems, reading disorders of children in their classroom? Because the children are there day in and day out, and they need that kind of help. The teachers being trained today in schools of higher education, in many cases, are simply not getting access to the kind of training that is based on the insights that the research has revealed to us. We need to close that gap, and we need to ensure that our teachers are ready for the schools of the 21st century.
I think when we talked on the phone, you mentioned that ultimately this could be thought of as a social educational challenge, that we need to get the teachers up to speed on what we've learned in brain science, and we need to get the nation as a whole to kind of reframe its sense of how important it is to come into alignment with what we've learned, rather than to hang on to its mythical approaches.
Well, I think public education, public awareness of the reading crisis has taken us so far. I think there's an awareness, certainly, that there's a problem. There's an awareness that there are certain kinds of activities that make sense for parents and teachers to engage in. What hasn't happened is for that awareness to be translated into action and decisions about curriculum, decisions about educational materials, and decisions about the way teachers are prepared for the classroom. That kind of awareness needs to be built. We need to do it.
Really nice to do this.
Okay.
Let's go all the way back to something you said about self-esteem.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of connect the dots there between where we just were and there. My sense of talking to parents and teachers is that they have this undifferentiated sense, even though they may have some intellectual awareness that this is unnatural, their kind of gut level sense, this is natural.
Hmm.
That
reading is natural, or what?
Yeah,
or that
kids should be able to read.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can read. Why can't they read? What must be wrong with them?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than this reading thing is a radically unnatural challenge to the human brain,
Right.
which there is no evolutionary precedent.
Right.
And it's in relation to this technology. This thing is as much a machine as a VCR or a dishwasher.
Yeah.
And this machine is pretty confused based on the way that it's grown to be here. It's a 500-year-old invention that's been
There you go.
unwatched over. I had Videsky, the linguists and neuroscience that pretty much all agree. Yep, nobody was minding the store when all this mess just kind of happened. So we have our children, most of them, in some degree of struggle that's diminishing their ability to learn because they're trying to interface with a technology which is a mess because nobody's ever paid attention to it. Try to do anything about it as if how all the children learn it is important. Now, my sense is parents and teachers don't get that.
The reading is not natural. Speaking language, oral language, is natural. What does a baby do when it's born? It cries. It's natural. But reading has to be learned and has to be taught. It's not a natural activity. It's a difficult activity for a significant percentage of children. It is not difficult for a certain percentage of children. They can pick up reading very easily, no matter which way it's taught. Why? We're not sure why, but it happens. Other children need to be taught in a very different way, very systematically, intensively, breaking the process down into its components. And they need to learn it hands-on in a multisensory fashion. The good news is that almost all kids can learn to read if they have access to that kind of instruction. And it's your point about language, I don't know if I can actually address about it being a mess or whatever. Reading, as you point out, is only, a few thousand years old. And our brain is still getting used to it. We're evolving.
For any massive population.
Yeah.
A couple hundred years.
For mass literacy.
Yeah.
Right.
Which would mean whatever would affect any kind of
Right.
selective adaptation
Yeah.
pressures.
Yeah.
Brain ability. Yes. So there's also this will be on the tape, but just between us, I'll make sure it doesn't go anywhere else. The head of the California School Board, guy by the name of Reed Hastings, who happens to also be the CEO of Netflix.
We use Netflix.
Okay.
Do you use Netflix?
I haven't used Netflix, but
Netflix is terrific.
It is.
It is.
One of the best
It's brilliant.
of the web. And
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
He's brilliant.
Yeah.
He's an engineering type. And he's actually as interested in what we're trying to work out in our experiments about how to shift this in our teacher trainings and other things that we're starting to experiment with in anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so he and the Silicon Valley Foundation that he's associated with have put some money.
Good.
So right now it's private individuals, but
Yeah.
they've all said, look, here's the anti-money, go get it from the big guys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I've been trying to knock on those doors and we appreciate any and all help that you could suggest. suggest?
Oh gosh, I don't know. Of course, we're all struggling in that area too. It's a tough one. I'm not sure if this would be up their line, but we work with the Cisco Foundation, and Chambers has dyslexia, and they've been funding us for a number of projects now. Very interested in e-learning issues, interested in learning disabilities to the extent that they have that they're connected, they have an impact on certain other kinds of the issue of learning, how to make learning adaptable for the greatest number of people who may present different kinds of needs to it.
I mean, you've been very helpful in creating
Yeah.
doors for me. And I
Yeah.
very much appreciate an opportunity there.
Sure.
And I think that there's a really good case for the kind of fulcrum efficiency of what we're doing to help this problem for what it costs to lift what we're about here.
Good.
And I'd love to participate in it. So when we left on the question track, I wanted to kind of circle back to the self-esteem conversation, because in addition to the economic things, and as you say, this is human potential cost. But even when we say human potential cost, it's what the national perspective might be. Or we look at it as a nation, or human potential is. But from the child's point of view, from the family's point of view, it's human suffering.
Well, anyone who works with children who have learning disabilities confronts the issue of low self-esteem head on. I mean, by the time a child is usually identified with a problem in reading, and the identification is made that there's a learning disability, that child usually needs to be put back together in some way. Stuff has happened. There's been failure, and usually over a long period of time. And a child usually then, by the time that special education services are provided or some other kind of instruction is provided, needs some serious help with esteem. Now, we've actually looked into this at the National Center for Learning Disabilities. We've worked with researchers, and one of the best ways to address the self-esteem problem is through skill development. And children who actually are able to build their skills, show an increase in self-esteem that's every bit as high as programs that might address their self-esteem head-on. So in other words, by focusing on skill development, working on instructional issues, you can often bring the self-esteem up in the same way that might happen if a child were involved in some kind of social and emotional development program that directly addresses the issue of self-esteem.
I kind of take some passion here. I've been quite involved for a number of years with the self-esteem community. In fact, its most visible proponent that Gary Trudeau raked over the coals when he started it back in the 80s was Senator from California, Vasconcellos, who brought self-esteem to national attention when he created the California Task Force to investigate it. It had a social vaccine-like fulcrum leverage. And of course, it's been taken, as you kind of suggest there, off to this extreme. Like we could go around pumping up children's self-esteem independent of how their actual progress is. My own sense, in the sense of dialogue with scientists and researchers in that space, is that children have a problem with self-esteem. They have a problem of learning to be self-disesteeming. They learn to not trust, to not feel good about themselves. It's an acquired kind of microtime shame.
Well, I think low self-esteem causes a child to pull back. I mean, to not engage. And why go out there, put yourself on the line if you know that it's going to be another failure and that you're going to be called on it, either by your teacher or by your classmates, and you're open to shame, you're open to disapproval. I mean, kids aren't dumb. They know when something isn't working, and they know what's going to hurt, so they pull back. And what children need is the experience of having success. That is what nourishes self-esteem. And success in building skills is one of the best ways to do it. They have shown that they can actually master something, and they have the proof. They can point to it and they can be legitimately praised for it. That's what works.
Back to the reading thing.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to this kind of cognitive summary level shame, and I don't want to do it again, conscious, volitional, I don't want to do that. There's an almost animal level, biological shame mechanism. We're going back to this affect science. And what it basically says is that human beings are shame averse. Almost by nature, we're shame averse. On the one hand, shame is this great learning lens. At the animal level, shame is the learning prompt. The bio-animal level in us. At the self-reflexive level, shame is we don't want to have it. We want to avoid it. In fact, there's been a map that's been laid out called the compass of shame that goes into all the different things we do to get away from shame when it happens. That happens precognitively. I mean, this is underneath the whole engine that's projecting our experience. It's not something that we're volitionally controlling. We don't want to experience shame, and the very feeling of shame will cause us to move away from it, how we're processing what's going on. So, all the more critical that in the case of reading, we're talking about a situation where children are day after day, week after week, month after month, in some cases year after year, immersed in an environment. It's frustrating them in some way, and that's causing them to feel insufficient. The way the context works is if there's something wrong with them. My understanding of this emerging is that as that happens in children, this shame aversion starts to interscript with this decoding, with the learning to read process. Once it does, there's an aversion even to learning to read that's precognitive. I mean, it's deep. So this shame thing is really, really important.
I think the low self-esteem, the sense of shame is lifelong. The National Center for Learning Disabilities, we have a wonderful board of directors. We have at least 2 individuals on that board, both of whom have dyslexia, and both of whom are former governors. Extraordinarily accomplished individuals, both of them dyslexic. And both have talked at length about the continuing sense, not just of frustration or it's not just memories of failure, but precisely a sense of shame that is still remembered, classroom-based, other children around, a teacher, not being able to do what other children seem to be able to do so easily. It stays for a lifetime.
Talked about before, you touched on what the relationship to education and the evolving need for educated people by the emerging world marketplace business, particularly in our country. That used to be 50 years ago, 100 years ago, certainly far beyond that, where the rate of change was sufficiently stable that we could say, well, we need so many mathematicians, drafts people, or whatever it was, and kind of pick, develop a relatively crude and mechanical railroad track switching system about aptitudes and kind of almost grow and harvest people to fit what we projected the need was. I mean, being kind of crude, but you get the drift of where I'm going. Today, this is absurd. What we can say children need to learn to read, we can say that they need to be fluent with mathematical skills, both of which are artificial code skills, happening in different time scales. They need to be able to write and express themselves, which is another artificial code skill, happening in a different time scale. It's not high frequency critical like reading. And they need to be able to interface with the other kinds of codes and technology, to be able to learn what they need to learn when they encounter a need to learn it in the future. All these things translate into how well someone learns. But how well children learn is fundamentally more important than what in particular they learn. Now, what in particular they're learning is an exercise environment to help enrich and extend their general capacity for learning as they unfold in life, because that's what's relevant 20 years from now. We can't predict anything in particular other than these basic skills I've said that would be more relevant than how well they can learn when they get there. How is it that and come all the way back to where we were a while ago.
Mhm.
It seems like we need to be stewarding the health of our children's learning as our fundamental, central educational mission, rather than, which doesn't negate curriculum, but reframes it, reorients it. How does that wash with you? What do you think?
We, as we look at kids who struggled to learn, whether that struggle is related to an underlying learning disability, whether it's related to issues of poverty or English as a second language, we have an obligation to make sure that those kids have access to a curriculum. And the curriculum, I think, has to address, I don't think this is probably for the camera, but let me just answer your question.
Please.
Let me just answer your
Please.
question.
Thank you.
I think it's both, it's one and the other. It's both and. The idea of creating simply a generation of students that are expert at thinking and thinking things through at the expense of content knowledge, whether that content knowledge is history, mathematics, literature, whatever it might be, I think is absurd. You've got to balance the two.
Right.
Now, one can't be at the expense of the other.
But with technology getting to a point where it's becoming more pervasive, every television set's going to have the power of a computer, 10 years from now, 15 years from now or something. So that any conceivable, articulatable question that a human being can come up with can be the basis for piloting through the super Googles of the future.
Well,
what is content other than an exercise environment for getting to be better learners?
I think, look at it this way. I mean, think back to, the fact that too many kids right now are entering kindergarten without the context and the content that vocabulary provides. They are at risk.
Sure, but it's not
they
the
are at risk.
particular words, it's the exercise and distinction.
It's the particular words as well. I think it's both the exercise of the
Are
mind.
you saying that we could say with respect to first graders that we've got a word list that they should know, or that they should know a list of words?
They should know a list of words.
Okay,
And there are some words, because they're used so often, because they're the building blocks
Sure.
of subjects and curriculum, that are more important than others. But they're needed. They have to have them. And so I'd say the same thing about content. I just read, there was a letter to the editor in the New York Times. There's a mother whose son had just graduated from Harvard and was praising the curriculum reform that's underway at Harvard, saying, gosh, I wish this had happened when my son was there. He is one of the best thinkers I've ever seen, but he doesn't know anything. He lacks content knowledge. And so and that means a frame of reference. You might be able to Google anything, but understanding whether it's historical content, literary content, or whatever, may be lacking and puts that person at a disadvantage.
Good. So we're in sync about this. So now we're talking about how is it that we develop a sense of perspective, a sense of the background from which to comprehend one's life, one's civilization, where we are. That's the background reference for this ability to extend into learning about things that we can't predict right now.
Well, learning is lifelong. And what we know, because of the work we do at the National Center for Learning Disabilities, that learning disabilities are lifelong. And the problem doesn't go away. It stays there, has to be addressed. Tools have to be used, whether built by the person himself or because of accommodations, whatever it might be, so that that person can access the kind of content, the kind of knowledge that becomes important as you move throughout your life. I think it's the issue of curiosity, the issue of intellectual curiosity is extraordinarily important. Henry James's point, be a person upon whom nothing is lost. doesn't apply only to novelists, writers, but it should apply to all of us. That constant inquiry, constant curiosity about how the world works, how to make sense of it, is something that all of us not only have to encourage in ourselves, but also in our children.
Yeah, that's really well said. For me, that translates into not the Baconian adage that knowledge is power, but that knowledge is the power of knowledge is resourcefulness to learning.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that we didn't cover that you think we ought to?
Well, I think you're wanting to demonstrate, as you pointed out, showing a child engaged in the act of reading, and showing that, and then also demonstrating, what is happening in the brain. I think would be fascinating to show.
Absolutely.
I think that, again, understanding sort of what works can sometimes best be done by showing what doesn't work for some individuals. In other words, it's through disabilities sometimes that ability is best understood. Because the majority of kids get it. The majority of kids can do this. They can read. Some with a lot of help, some with almost no help. There is a group of kids that need extraordinary help, intensive help in getting them to read.
There's this gray spectrum between those that just can't and those that
yes, there
don't
is.
do it so well that it may be shaping their lives in some way, going all the way up to this
Right.
The other side of proficiency, which includes most children.
Yeah. We're not a nation of readers. We're not. We'd like to be, but I think our culture is still not supportive of reading the way it should be. Yeah.
Which again comes back to this technology interface skill, unnatural to the brain. That how well a child acquires it. It's all but fate.
Well, I think also again, so much of this is cultural. Apart from the biological, it's cultural. Is reading valued? Is it promoted not just with lip service, but is it truly promoted, valued? Is it encouraged? Is it demanded? Is it really part of family life? All those questions have to be answered yes, if we're really to have the kind of sea change we need, if we really move forward.
Which presupposes that our population generally goes through some kind of a transformative reframe about its appreciation of how significant it is.
I think, yes, and I think the understanding has to be that reading, you said reading is, knowledge is power. And we sometimes say, we talk about reading power. I don't think we've been effective yet in showing the power of reading. And if we show the true power of reading and the kind of impact it has on a person's life, I think then we'll start to get the message across that it's worth acquiring and that there is status involved in being expert at it. And we haven't done it yet.
And perhaps that if you love your child, you got to put the effort in to make sure that they don't have a struggle with this. You've got to help them. You've got to meet them in this, because this is fading their life. This is shaping their life.
Well, what we know from a number of polls that have been conducted is that many parents wait too long to take action, sometimes a year or more, before they actually go to professionals, whether it's to a pediatrician or to the schools, to say, I don't think my child is learning at the proper rate. I don't think my child is reading. And parents are often reluctant to do that. They don't want to draw attention to a potential problem in reading. For what reason? Because they don't want their child to be subject to shame? Well, or themselves. They don't want to appear to be certainly a bad parent. So we have to, and we've taken steps in this direction to encourage parents at the first sign of what they consider to be a problem to take action, to talk to a professional, to get help. And there are organizations and websites that are out there, including ours, that are set up to reach out to those parents.
I'm hopeful that with your help and the help of all the other people that we've kind of brought together into this conversation, dialogue that we're participating in, that we can somehow create some kind of a lightning rod, to say, you know what, socially we don't get it. There's something socially incredible as a nation. There's something incredibly important about this. It's not just about the utility of whether or not somebody can read this particular book or that particular book. But our nation's economy, how well we compete in the world, if you want to get on the practical end of the spectrum, or on the profound end of the spectrum, the psychological well-being of our children depends on us stepping up to a new understanding, a new appreciation of the unnaturalness of this challenge, how important it is that we help our children through it. We've got to galvanize attention here in a way that has never been done before. That's what this series is about.
Well, you'll do it. We'll help you.
Good. That's
Good.
what I wanted to hear.
Good.